let him then be emperor. For a good many reasons, the same enthusiasm and delight which had been conspicuous when he was made consul for life were no longer apparent. The longed for peace had proved only a truce. The English had broken the Treaty of Amiens after carefully refraining from carrying out any of the conditions which were disadvantageous to them, aroused by the colonial activity shown by the first consul's government and the anxiety felt at the reestablishment of peace on the continent. They had suddenly attacked the ships of France in every sea. The ocean was closed, and to reopen the seaports, it was necessary to go and seek the key in London at the cost of further blood, treasure, and distress. It had been necessary to reconstruct the army, which had been reduced only 2 years before, and conscription weighed heavily upon a people who, under the monarchy, had supported only small armies, in which all the officers and most of the men had enlisted of their own accord. The expenditure would be heavy. Since 1795, the revolutionary armies had generally lived upon the enemy, and even made a considerable profit out of them. But this army, with the necessary fleet and transports, would have to be paid for good French money. Again, it was not certain that the establishment of a hereditary government would be a safeguard against the plots of the royalists. Even the staunchest and most devoted of Bonaparte's followers were not convinced of it. The day after the first proceedings taken by the Senate, Duroc wrote to Davout, "The first consul has not yet given his decision, but I know well that it will be final, and that we at any rate will all of us show ourselves ever faithful and attached to him. For my part, although there is much in the current report which displeases me, I would willingly shed my blood in upholding whatever the first consul thinks beneficial to the country." Doubtless. But what did the first consul consider beneficial? And since there was talk of a hereditary government, who was to be the heir? Eugène de Beauharnais, whose adoption rumor had suggested, was out of the question, the method of adoption not being sufficiently monarchical. It was apparently resolved to declare certain of the consul's brothers to be his successors, a lame expedient. The confidence felt by the nation in her hero was not extended to his brothers. Lucien alone was well known, and he almost exclusively in the parliamentary world and among the men of letters. His fame was slight. He was not popular, and the other brothers were quite unknown. Besides, Lucien was in great disfavor with the consul. He lived out of France, and little notice was taken of him except by a few malcontents. Joseph had been appointed by the consul to play an important part in several negotiations, and had even seemed to conduct them, yet he gained no reputation thereby. He had put his signature, Bonaparte, at the bottom of treaties, but there was only one Bonaparte, the consul, and it was he who had really signed. As to Louis, he was never heard of, which was as well.